Greetings. Today we're going to talk about inequality and specifically what inequality is and is not. In the media today, the word inequality is used and overused to such a ridiculous degree that it has no real meaning anymore. Plus, there is now a severe misconception about what inequality really is versus what it isn't, and I will explain what the real inequality is, which is contrary to what is being perpetuated throughout the media. So I go to chapter 9 of my Atom publication, and what we're going to do is just read off the first 4 paragraphs of the Atom publication verbatim, because that sets the stage for how we're going to define what inequality actually is and is not. So I hide my face. There seems to be an inordinate amount of discussion about inequality in society, even though it focuses only on ratios of financial income between cherry-picked examples. When the social media hordes opine on this subject, there is often a comical inability to distinguish between income and net worth. Even worse, when people in positions of power address the topic, there's a fixation on financial inequality rather than the various other inequalities that exist between people. Health and vitality, attractiveness, likability, physical abilities, cancer susceptibility, communication skills, quality of relationships, the climate where they live, their commute, etc. Why is the facile metric of financial income ratios between arbitrarily selected strata suddenly a dominant crisis of our age, when by most statistical measures, inequality is far less than it was for the majority of human existence? The political push behind inequality is mostly because monetary assets are the only possession that can be forcibly transferred from one person to another. If one person is much more attractive than another, amputating the former's nose and grafting it onto the latter's face as a second nose will make both of them much less attractive than they were before the operation, despite their redistribution. Sadly, the process of forcible wealth redistribution destroys wealth and social values with much the same effect. Proponents continually refuse to see the evidence of the failure of this system in country after country. However, there is a different track of financial inequality that is more valid, and where the focus should migrate to. Now that money creation by central banks has to become permanent and ever rising, it is absolutely valid to complain about how QE money accumulates in the hands of extremely few people, who then may or may not spend it in a way that diffuses across the economy. The executives and shareholders of the largest banks, as well as the holders of U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, are disproportionate recipients of U.S. QE, even ahead of other billionaires in other sectors. This is not only unfair, but after QE1, QE2, and QE3, the finite and diminishing effectiveness of this sort of very narrowly concentrated money creation was becoming more obvious even in 2016, let alone now. Therefore, in addition to being essential that newly created money be given to individuals, the dues of central bank money addresses a large portion of the inequality debate, because what can be fairer than every U.S. citizen receiving the same share of the required monetary creation? Inequality is not best addressed by taxing the most productive or by conflating assets with income or by assuming that two people of the same income are equally prosperous if they are at very different stages of life and have very different obligations. The real inequality of this era is something quite different. So we can pause right there. The real inequality is not one of money in a contemporary sense as much as it is one of era. If you look back at your great-grandparents, and remember you have 8 great-grandparents, and if you thought about what they did for a living and what their standard of living was, you will very quickly see that you have a much higher standard of living than most or all of your great-grandparents, often by a huge degree. Sure, some people may have anecdotes about how their great-grandfather was someone of very high importance, but that is, of course, anecdotal and a very cherry-picked metric. You have to consider all of your great-grandparents, all 8 of them, and most of your great-grandmothers were housewives. There is very little chance that any of them were doing anything other than having children and raising them. The material standard of living that they had was very, very low. And for that, we go to the first chart that we'll go to in this video, which is over here. This chart is from Max Roser, and this is the share of the world's population that lives in absolute poverty, 1820 to 2015, and we can project it up to 2021. There's no reason to go further back than 1820, because if you extended this chart leftwards for a full kilometer all the way back to prehistoric times, you would nonetheless see a number that's close to 100%. So only after 1820 did poverty meaningfully start to decline. And even in that sense, From 1820 all the way to 1970, you went from 94% to 60% poverty. Some progress, but not a lot, even in 150 years, from 1820 to 1970. And then after 1970, it was very fast. From 1970, 60%. In 2015, it is only 10%. And by 2021, it's even closer to zero than now. 60% to single-digit percentages in just 1970 to present. That is what has already occurred in our world. You would think that you would be hearing about this more, but human poverty has reduced substantially within the lifetimes of a lot of people who are still alive today. And sure, there are some dysfunctional basket cases that are no more prosperous than they were in 1970, in particular the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Afghanistan, Haiti, places like that. But excluding those dysfunctional basket cases, the rest of the world has substantially moved out of poverty by a huge margin. That is not in dispute. That has, in fact, occurred within the last few decades. And this is the poverty standard of $2 a day. You could choose a higher threshold, $5 a day, and you would get a curve of similar shape. The percentages would be higher, but it would be parallel to the $2 curve. This is happening exponentially, and it is happening as we speak, which means that you are extremely fortunate to even be alive today versus your grandparents or great-grandparents who were alive at an earlier phase of this chart. They lived in a world of much more poverty, and they themselves probably were poor as well. And we can illustrate that point by going to a similar chart that takes a longer time frame and projects the exponential growth of economic progress a little bit further as well. So we go there. I speak about the exponential rate of economic progress in more detail in this video up here in this card, but I borrow a chart from that video to discuss what we're discussing right now. This chart is a little bit hard to read, so let me explain it. It is world per capita GDP, and then leftward is further back in time, years ago from 2050. So right now we are about 29 years before 2050, so we're about here. 100 years before 2050 is 1950, 200 years is 1850, and so forth, all the way up to 550 years before 2050, which was the year 1500. And just like the prior chart, you could extend this chart leftward for 100 meters or more, all the way to prehistoric time, then you would get a flat line. Even though there was an exponential trend present, it was too weak in those early stages to amount to anything. Therefore, the chart is only meaningful in starting from 1500 onwards. So after 1500, you could see there was gradual economic growth, but still not enough to make a meaningful change within a human lifetime, and human lifetimes were shorter than anyway. Then it started to rise, and then it started to get steeper. And even major historical negative events like the Great Depression really didn't deviate anything from the trend line all that much. Whatever negative movement from the trend line had occurred because of something like the Great Depression, it reverted right back to the trend line. The same happened with the coronavirus crisis of our times. And by 1950, you see things are starting to rise faster and faster. And remember, this vertical axis is exponential. Now, green is what has already occurred. Green is in the past. This has already occurred. Blue is just the projection of the existing exponential trend. So all I'm doing with the blue line is projecting this centuries established trend, and nonetheless by 2050, which is just 29 or even 28 years away, depending on when you see this video, we get to a very high level of human prosperity. Remember, half of all economic growth has happened just in the last 20 years, and there will be a time in the near future where we can say half of all economic growth has happened after 2021. So we are going to get to a tremendous stage of abundance very, very soon. Now, most of your grandparents and great-grandparents must have lived in this era over here, and they lived in substantial poverty. Your more distant ancestors, we don't even have to talk about them, but they lived over here. And the further back you go, the worse it was. Now, the real inequality, therefore, is one of era. Think of how different the world is today, the number of skill sets that can be monetized. Back in the old days, centuries ago, there were maybe 4 professions that men could do and only 2 professions that women could do, and that's it. All the people who are knowledge workers today making a lot of money, they would have done poorly in those days because the thing that they are good at was simply not something that could be monetized, something that the economy demanded. Think of all the indoor jobs that are cushy in nice offices, or now even better, working from home over telework. that just could not have existed in the past, and you could not have done something in such a pleasant environment that pays this much. Now, all basic necessities are much cheaper. All these commodities are very inexpensive. And here we are on YouTube. Look at all the big YouTubers that we all are familiar with. Most of them, before doing YouTube, were on pretty ordinary career trajectories. None of them had a really good resume, and most of them were just very young at the time of starting YouTube. And now some of them are making millions of dollars a year. They are monetizing a skill set that could not have been monetized even by their parents. Because not only did YouTube not exist, but all the equipment, the high-resolution cameras, the microphones, the editing software, all that had to become accessible. And now you have YouTubers making a lot of money when their life was not on any high-paying trajectory before they started YouTube. Similarly, consider how many new types of business now exist in the high-tech age just in terms of software and software distribution. Once you load a good piece of software onto the internet and are able to charge for it, then there's no distribution channel you can sell to anywhere in the world. More and more things that get converted into software can also avail themselves of this, such as music. There are musicians earning royalties from songs in countries that the musician has never ever even been to, and they will earn royalties for decades after the song has been produced and released. All that is going on. And therefore, there is a tremendous difference between what skill sets can be monetized now versus what could have been monetized even a generation ago. And this continues to improve. Even if you think YouTube is saturated, there'll be a new social media platform from which new people emerge, and they also will make a lot of money. And many of them were not on a trajectory of some high-paying career before that. That will continue to happen. More and more skill sets are being monetized, and therefore the people monetizing them are luckier than their own parents, let alone their grandparents. And that is the big inequality of our age. Were you born in a time when whatever you do the best is something that is profitable or that you can earn a living from? That is the big inequality of our age. It is not about whether this person's a billionaire, therefore we must take from billionaires and give to people who don't want to work and that type of thing. No, that is what you hear in the media. That is a very, very, very outdated way of thinking about these things. The big inequality is one of era. And this is the first of many videos where I'm going to talk about inequality. And in the passage that I read from the Atom publication in the beginning of this video, I mentioned my DUES program, which is an acronym for Direct Universal Exponential Stipend. And that is a paradigm of how central bank monetary creation, which has to be done exponentially anyway in order to offset technological deflation, should be given directly to people in equal amounts, and that reduces inequality better than anything else. And that is something I speak about in other chapters of my Atom publication as well as other videos on this channel. But that is the best way to reduce inequality because you are not tackling the inequality of effort. You're only tackling the inequality of era, which was entirely not within a person's control, whereas effort is within a person's control. So there will be a lot of other videos on this channel about the topic of inequality, but this is just the starter one that perhaps helps you think differently about what inequality actually is and is not. And if you like these types of subjects and this type of content, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.